This is the 12th episode of the Mendez Movie Report Podcast. I am your host and namesake film critic Louis A. Mendez. And on this episode, in which I cover the news from the week of July 13th, 2026, that most caught my attention, I will review the latest wide releases of Moana, Evil Dead Burn, and The Invite. I will also talk about some major award season machinations as TIFF begins to reveal their slate and focus and neon make some big moves themselves. I will be reacting to the late breaking news as I record this regarding Sam Neill's sudden passing. And of course, as always, to get the latest box office news, along with what's coming next to theaters and streaming. And of course, the big subject of this podcast episode will be the situation involving the box office this past weekend, in which you had two nostalgia bait films that should have been two big event films for whether you were taking your family out to the movies or you were a horror fan, and both movies ended up not doing that great at the box office. I know that I've been promising this for months, but we are getting closer and closer to me getting a proper intro for the podcast, especially since things are going to be very, very, very quiet next weekend. I am recording this just hours before I get to go see the Odyssey, so I'm trying to get this through over and done with as quick as possible, so I can get everything ready to be published, and I can get dressed up and all that, and go over to my local theater where I will be getting to see the Odyssey, so that I can, of course, be in time to for review embargo to get my review out. So let's go ahead and get started on this episode. We got plenty of cover, even with me not even covering as much as I used to. Starting with this episode, we've got a lot to cover. And obviously, the biggest news of this past week is the fact that Disney dropped a brand new live action film in Moana. Um, I will talk a little bit later about the fact that the movie is not doing as well at the box office as Disney was kind of hoping. Um, Now, the plot, if you don't know it yet, considering that this is a live action remake to a film animated film that came out 10 years ago, and its sequel came out 2 years before. Um, the plot by Letterbox has it as Moana answers the ocean's call and, for the first time, voyages beyond the reef of her island of Matanui with the infamous demigod Maui on an unforgettable journey to restore prosperity to her people, which is, again, is the exact same damn plot of the movie it's remaking from 10 years ago. And I am super hit or miss with the Disney live action remakes. There are some that have worked for me. Little Mermaid, Aladdin. I know that's a bit controversial for some for me to mention Aladdin among the ones that have worked for me. Beauty and the Beast, Jungle Book, Cinderella. Lady and the Tramp worked for me, and I'm learning that there are people who really can't stand that remake. But there are others that have left me really cold. I'm not a fan of of a couple of them out there. And when these remakes fail, they usually fall into one or two categories. Either they just misunderstand and bastardize the source material. I'm talking about like Maleficent, Dumbo, Mulan, Lilo and Stitch. Those come to mind, or they're just completely lifeless shot for shot recreations that just they don't offer any reason to exist beyond like corporate brand recognition. I mean, like The Lion King is a prime example of that. The 2019 film, I will never forget going to see that 2019 film, and my current wife was like really, really excited to go see that movie. And I was kind of like, I don't know, there's something that's not clicking with me watching some of the marketing for this film. And when the movie was done, we looked at each other like, what the hell was that? I mean, the movie made I think like over $2 billion. It's one of the biggest box office successes of all time. And that it was just such a soulless remake. And it really like was one of those live action remakes that made it seem like, yeah, there was absolutely no need to do this. You could have watched a much better version with the animated film, and there's absolutely no heart and soul to this. And unfortunately, the Moana remake falls into that camp like The Lion King. That's why this doesn't work for me as a remake compared to the other remakes that did work for me, or even the remakes that my beef with them was more that what they tried to do different didn't work with me. What makes this especially disappointing is that look, Moana is one of my favorite films of 2016. It's one of the few Disney proper animated movies from the past decade that I consider like close to top tier. And going to this remake, I did have concerns based on the marketing. The trailers just looked like I was watching some AI generated stuff. And it looked like it lacked the charm that made the original special. And sadly, every single one of those red flags ended up becoming a reality watching the movie for myself, which Disney did not provide me a press screening for. So I had to go ahead and go do the work to go out and see this for myself with audiences. Um, and that's why my review for it unfortunately was a little bit late for me to publish. To the film's credit, I was actually somewhat on the wavelength during the first act. The opening stretches are where I do think the movie feels most alive because Catherine Lagaya, and I really, really hope I didn't butcher her last name. I think she did a pretty good job in the title role. I've seen some people say that she fell flat for them, but I didn't get that same vibe watching her performance as Moana. I think she understands what makes her an engaging protagonist. I think she brings genuine energy and charisma and heart to the character with even with the material she's given. And whenever she's on screen, I do see someone who's trying her hardest to elevate the material around her. The problem is that basically everything else surrounding her just completely fails her. Um, w- During the first act, I remember thinking, man, I think I might end up being a big in the big minority on this. I'm actually digging this film, and I was seeing that the reviews for this movie have been really rough. So I'm like, man, I don't know what's going on, but I think I really vibe with this movie for the most part. I wasn't like ready to give it like an A minus or anything like that. But then it's like once the seafaring adventure begins and the main plot starts kicking into gear, that's where the film starts looking and feeling less like a movie, more like an AI generation of one. Like the visuals have this strange synthetic quality that has plagued so many recent blockbusters, but in this one in particular, everything technically looks expensive, but it doesn't feel tangible. It doesn't feel alive. It looks so manufactured. And scene after scene recreates moments from the animated film, but without capturing that sense of wonder, that excitement, or the emotional sincerity that made those sequences so memorable in the first place. The musical numbers, I think, suffer from this. Look, the soundtrack is still fantastic because it's obviously drawing from the same songs that helped make the original film so good. But while the music itself survives intact, the presentation doesn't. The musical set pieces just don't have the energy or vibrancy or visual imagination of the animated counterpart. It doesn't feel joyful. It doesn't feel like I'm watching a couple showstoppers. It just feels like obligations that the movie has to make sure to get in. And to me, the biggest problem with the movie that really brings it down, and had it not been a huge issue, I would have probably been a little higher on this, maybe even in the positive camp. There is Dwayne the Rock Johnson as Maui. The Rock was one of the highlights of the original movie. He brought great charisma and larger than life personality to the character. He is Maui. He is that character, but here he's like unrecognizable, not because of the bad wig, even with that, not because of the bad wig, just because of that, but because of how disengaged he looks in his scenes. This is one of the weakest performances I've seen from him in years. It comes across as he's completely checked out and delivering a performance that feels like he's not inhabiting that character. He's more like feeling this contractual obligation of this project that he got himself into before moving on to whatever project he's actually excited about, because he is linked to the A24 movies and the Scorsese film and all this other stuff. Every scene with Maui should be bursting with personality, and instead many of them feel so flat, and he looks so checked out in them. Now, one advantage Moana does have over some of the other remakes is that it doesn't actively damage the original story. It does have that going for it because it is largely a shot for shot reincarnation, so fans don't have to worry about any like bastardizing of the material. Um but that's also part of the problem in a weird way. The film is so committed to recreating the original that it never justifies its own existence. Like The Little Mermaid at least tried to address some issues with the original. Beauty and the Beast tried to add a little bit of extra depth to the lore. Um, Jungle Book tried to do some things different in in the big finale. It just simply reminds you how much better the animated version is by watching something that's so shot for shot. And whereas something like a How to Train Your Dragon, which I gave a positive review to, even though it was completely shot for shot, was that it didn't feel like it was lacking that energy and enthusiasm to me compared to the first movie. And it seemed to be pretty well put together. It seemed to be like what I would expect a well done medieval family film to look like. This is different. This looks so AI generated and so lifeless. Like I said, it just reminds me so much of the 2019 Lion King movie, and that's ultimately the biggest issue with Moana. It's not offensively bad. I do think there are certain reviews out there, like I'm seeing people giving this what are tantamount to like D and F tier reviews. This movie's nowhere near that bad, but this is, and it's not my pick for the worst live action remake Disney has produced, by the way. But it does exist in that frustrating middle ground where it's almost like it offers nothing new while failing to match the magic of the film it's copying. And outside of our lead performance, from Catherine, who I do think is a committed and good performance. There's very little here that improves on or even equals what audiences got back in 2016. And by the time the credits rolled, I just couldn't shake the feeling that many parents taking their kids to see this will leave wondering why they didn't just stay home and watch the original instead. The animated Moana remains a modern Disney classic, in my opinion, and this remake mostly serves as a reminder of that fact. So, to recap, the pros. In the title role, Catherine Lagaya locks in as Moana and gives the film its best energy. The great soundtrack from the first film returns, and it is a shot for shot remake, which means there is no bastardizing of the source material to worry about. Um, and the first act, I do think, is the strongest part of the movie. But the cons: a wigged up Dwayne the Rock Johnson putting in an incredibly forgettable performance, mailed in performance, and it showcases how lifeless and soulless this live action remake can come off as every time he's on screen. The film looks and feels like it was AI generated once the main plot kicks in. The musical set pieces have no real energy to them versus the source material's renditions, and ultimately, it will leave many parents who take their kids to see this wondering why they didn't just stay home and watch the 2016 film on Disney Plus. So, my initial grade and what I expect will end up being my final grade for Moana is a C plus. I cannot in good conscience recommend this to you unless you're like a super, super massive Moana fan and just want to see how they executed this. I really cannot recommend this to you. I would say just wait a couple months when it inevitably shows up on Disney Plus. Now, Moana was not just the only really big release of this past week, and especially franchise wise, because we did get a brand new Evil Dead movie. And I've been someone who has always vibed with the Evil Dead films. I think the first two films are some of the better horror films of its time and years. Army of Darkness, I think, is a fun movie, even with its flaws. And the 2013 Evil Dead sort of reboot, not a reboot. I think it's a pretty solid horror film, and I really liked Evil Dead Rise. I actually had it on my ballot for best horror films of 2023. I want to say this one that came out. So I really dig the Evil Dead Rise and what that story did. Um, but I'm sad to say that Evil Dead Burn, which is the brand new one, is the first film in the franchise that I didn't really vibe with. I'm still kind of going back and forth and seeing how I might feel it, whether I'll feel better or worse about this movie as the year goes. But let me get the plot out of the way so you understand. Via Letterbox, the plot for Evil Dead Bird is after the loss of her husband, a woman seeks solace with her in-laws. As one by one they transform into deadites, they come to discover that the vows that she took in life survive even in death. And I've been turning this one over and over in my head since the credits rolled because I really cannot decide whether I'm slightly positive or slightly negative on it. At the moment, as I wrote the review and here recording the podcast, I am on the slightly negative side. But I can definitely see this one being one of those movies that people are going to connect with much more than I did. And I have seen some people who are defending the movie more and being more positive on it. Now, to be clear, there are things here that work, which maybe will end up making a case for it that I'll end up liking it more by the end of the year. The gore is absolutely relentless and features some genuinely gnarly, stomach churning moments that will have horror fans wincing in their seats. If you're coming to an Evil Dead movie looking for inventive carnage, buckets of blood, and practical effects driven nastiness, Burn does deliver on that front. There are a handful of sequences that are directed really well, showcasing the kind of visual flair and intensity that has become a hallmark for the franchise. And in particular, for this film alone, just has some really cool directed scenes. I do appreciate the film's central metaphor surrounding abusive relationships and the difficulty of escaping them. There is an interesting thematic backbone with this one about the emotional attachments that keep people trapped in unhealthy situations, even when they know they need to leave. It's a compelling idea and it gives the movie something substantial to chew on rather than simply finding gruesome ways to torture its cast. Unfortunately, that's also where a lot of my issues kind of begin because for a movie that spends nearly 2 hours with these characters, I found them kind of difficult to invest in or care that much about. Like most of the cast feels underwritten and forgettable. By the time the horror really kicks into high gear, I wasn't like really attached to anyone, which made many of the emotional beats kind of fall flat for me. Even with the in laws being representative of a larger problem that allowed our protagonist's marital abuse to go unchecked, I would have liked a little bit more depth to them. I also found myself growing a bit frustrated with how often the film seemed to prioritize shock value over storytelling. And look, Evil Dead has always been extremely gory, but the best entries in the franchise still balance that with that outrageous gore with memorable characters, dark humor, tension, and inventive filmmaking. Burn does feel that way a very few times here or there. Um, but uh, it's escalating the brutality a little more than dealing with the narrative around it. My biggest problem, however, with this one in particular, and we'll see if I can forgive it by years end, because again, I'm really struggling back and forth with this one instead of C plus instead of B minus. Is the pacing? The movie frequently feels like the prologue to a really great Evil Dead film, stretched out to nearly 2 hours. There's a lot of setup, a lot of wheel spinning, and not enough narrative progression to justify the runtime. As a result, the film starts to drag long before it reaches its conclusion. Several scenes feel like they're marking time rather than pursuing or pushing the story forward, and the movie never really fully shakes that feeling, or at least at me, it didn't. What's frustrating is that the ingredients for something stronger are all here. The themes are interesting, the gore is effective, and there are flashes of genuinely impressive direction throughout. But for me, they never come together in a satisfying way. Instead, the film feels caught between wanting to be a character driven horror story and wanting to be nonstop gore showcasing without fully succeeding at either. Um, Maybe this one will age better for me as the year goes on. I mean, we'll see. I might end up, when the Halloween season comes, I might binge all the Evil Dead movies and see how this one looks as a companion piece. Because some critics would disagree with me, but I do try to give a little bit of a franchise curve to certain movies. But horror has just been strangely inconsistent with me this year, and it's possible I'll revisit this down the road. I'll end up being pushed to the more positive side on it. But I can tell you that this is going to be easily my least favorite entry in the franchise so far. This is the first one since like I Army of Darkness was always my least favorite, even though I still kind of like that movie to a point. This is now easily my least favorite, and there are things here that horror fans will enjoy, especially if you're showing up here for the carnage. There's a lot of here for you that you're going to be entertained by, but I need a stronger story and more memorable characters to get on its wavelength. And in the end, Evil Dead Burn left me feeling more disappointed than entertained. Um, Overall, the pros, gnarly and gory sequences that will leave many horror fans wincing in their seats. An interesting metaphor on leaving abusive relationships and the attachments they bring. The cons, for me, very forgettable, very plainly written characters. Some horror moments come off as going for shock value over over story. Ultimately, feels like a prologue. What could have been a prologue to a would-be Evil Dead movie that is stretched out to nearly 2 hours and making it feel like an overlong film. I am so freaking mixed on this movie. I do wonder if I had seen it even a day before or after, if I would have been more willing to lean towards a barely positive. But at the moment, my initial thought is that it is a C plus. I don't want to say that I want to completely not recommend you go check this out. I think if you're a horror fan, and especially obviously if you're an Evil Dead maniac, though you've probably already seen this if you are, I would say maybe go check it out as a matinee. But other than that, this is gonna be dropping on HBO Max within a couple months anyway. And we'll see how I feel by the end of the year. But yeah, this was the first Evil Dead that I really struggled with on my first watch. Now, there is a conversation to be had about the box office for Moana and Evil Dead Burn, and if that means that there's this concern that's happening in Hollywood about nostalgia bait fatigue potentially kicking in. I will talk a little bit about them when I cover the overall result of the box office over the last weekend. But I did want to go ahead and get in a review for the invite, which originally I was not going to do a full blown detailed review of. But now that I've seen it and the fact that it did open wide and it is technically a brand new release for a vast majority of the country this past weekend, I liked the movie so much that I said, you know what, I need to do some kind of written review for this. And even at near midnight on a Saturday, I sat down and wrote something out. And the plot of the invite via letterbox is this: Joe and Angela's marriage is on thin ice when they invite their enigmatic upstairs neighbors for a dinner party. The night spirals into unexpected places. And this is a dramedy. It stars Olivia Wilde, who is the writer and director of this film. Excuse me, not the writer. Not the writer. She's the director. This is actually written by Rashida Jones. Yes, that Rashida Jones from Parks and Rec and The Office. That's exactly who helped write this. The other writer is and I'm looking for his name right here, which I should know. Apologies, as I'm should have been more prepared for this. Will McCormack, who, by the way, um, is generally known for like he wrote like Tom and Jerry stuff, some modern Tom and Jerry stuff. Um, but Rashida Jones is also in this, so and obviously she's probably the biggest name of the two here. They wrote this. Olivia Wilde directed it, and she stars in it alongside Seth Rogen, Penelope Cruz, Edward Norton, and um, you know, when it comes to Olivia Wilde as a director, finally, after two movies that I thought showed promise for her as a filmmaker, but I wasn't as enthusiastic about the stories and the characters at in their center. I I I was lower on book smart than other people were, but I was still generally kind of positive on, it, even though I had to warm up to it as some of the months passed by. And I was higher than other people on Don't Worry, Darling, but ultimately it was a movie that I thought was just okay. But I remember like thinking, man, Olivia Wilde there's some really good directing these movies. Unfortunately, the scripts and these characters are just failing her from me being even higher on these movies. And I think it's finally the recipe has come together for one of her directorial features here. The Invite is the film where I think Olivia Wilde fully is able to execute everything together. This is the first movie of hers that I can confidently call an A tier directorial effort, and it immediately establishes itself as one of the year's most fun surprises for me, as someone who's on paper. This shouldn't be my kind of movie. Relationship friction dramas are a genre that I tend to respect the themes of more than I love actually watching. For instance, Marriage Story, one of the most successful fiction dramas of the of late, that is easily my least favorite of that best picture lineup. Too often these kind of movies can feel repetitive, self-important, content to wallow in misery without offering any real hope beyond relationships are complicated and they don't all end good. Okay, well I know that. I live my life. I've had to deal with a tumultuous relationships in my life. Like I don't want to go to the movies and watch other people like just me personally. I know there are some people who love watching those kind of movies and are they can vibe with those kinds of movies. It's hard for me to vibe with those kinds of movies. But much like last year's Is This Thing On, which was one of my favorite films of in fact, one of my top 10 favorite films of last year, The Invite won me over because it understands that honesty and hope are not mutually exclusive. And I do appreciate that the screenplay allowed for some ugly truths in this while still offering a little sliver of hope. Um, it digs into the uncomfortable realities of relationships and attraction and resentment and emotional vulnerability without losing sight of the fact that people keep trying anyway. Or and whether you share or don't share my hopeful interpretation of its ambiguous ending, I did find that balance incredibly refreshing. What impressed me the most is how difficult this movie should have been to pull off. Wild here is juggling a remarkable number of tones and ideas all at once. The film swings between sharp comedy, romantic sentimentality, emotional drama, sexually charged humor without ever feeling disjointed. There are plenty of films that can handle one or two of these elements well, but there are few that can combine all of them into a cohesive whole and make it feel natural like this movie does. The performances are a huge part of why The Invite works as well as it does. Olivia Wilde proves herself just as capable in front of the camera as she is behind it, delivering some of the strongest work to date with a performance that balances vulnerability, wit, and emotional complexity. Seth Rogen continues his recent streak of impressive dramatic work, bringing grounded sincerity mixed with his typical brash, awkward, honesty brand of humor that makes even the film's messiest relationship moments still have their levity. And this is an audience film. My audience really, really reacted to this movie as we were watching it. Edward Norton is phenomenal. He's got a performance where he's both hilarious, he's charming, and quietly heartbreaking. Particularly with one monologue of his, which kind of comes out of nowhere. It's kind of weird how this movie, which is so funny throughout, so has these serious, dramatic moments. Penelope Cruz, she might be the standout of the ensemble for some people. She really does command every scene and that she enters, expertly navigating the film shifts between comedy, romance, and drama. Her character is, in a way, the most put together out of these four. Together, these four create a dynamic that feels completely natural, elevating every conversation and ensuring that the film's emotional and comedic beats land with equal impact. Um, So the ensemble here is absolutely on fire. This is one of those casts where every performer feels perfectly dialed into the material, understanding the wavelength the movie is operating on. The chemistry between these actors is what ultimately sells the film's larger themes and emotional turns for me, even when conversations become messy, uncomfortable, or hilariously awkward. The cast makes every interaction feel authentic. The writing gives them plenty to work with, but the performances elevate the material even further. And speaking of the writing, this is one of the year's strongest screenplays. The dialogue is razor sharp, it's consistently funny and witty. It's packed with enough emotional insight to keep the story from becoming merely a collection of entertaining conversations. The film is constantly revealing new layers to its characters and the relationships between them without feeling forced. By the time it does get to its final act, it feels like you spent an entire evening getting to know these people. This is the best director chamber piece I've seen, perhaps since Alfred Hitchcock's Rope, a movie from way back in 1948. And I know that's high praise. I know some people say that's a little too far to say that, but it's hard not to think of it while watching how confidently Olivia Wilde has navigates these confined spaces and even uses things like mirrors and windows alongside the interpersonal tension. The camera is constantly engaged with the characters, it's finding ways to keep conversations visually dynamic while quietly building suspense and emotional momentum underneath to what we are about to reveal as the movie keeps going on. For a movie that spends so much time focused on people talking, it never feels static or boring. The score deserves recognition, I think, even though I've seen some people who have their issues with it. I think it knows exactly when to step forward and when to stay out, get out of the way. It arrives at perfect moments to height of the scene, and I don't think it overwhelms it. For me, it's the kind of score that subtly enhances the movie's emotional impact and comedic moments while never calling attention to itself. What ultimately elevates the invite for me, though, is its finale. um, I'm not going to get into spoilers here, but it's the kind of ending that feels destined to spark this discussion. I suspect it will function as a litmus test for viewers and reveal a lot of what kind of romantic you are or aren't. Um, I found it to be a thoughtful, emotionally satisfying, and entirely consistent with what the film had been building toward. But I can see how some audiences might have different reactions. It's an ending that's going to test how you want to think of the ending to this movie. How you want to think about the building the building finality of where our main characters Angela and Joe's relationship is might end up as in the future. But that's also where the biggest caveat could come in. The movie embraces ambiguity in several areas, especially during that final stretch, including a certain thing that happens with the Edward Norton and Penelope Cruz character that might make people feel like, oh, you kind of took me out of the movie with that. Viewers looking for clear answers or a more straightforward resolution might find themselves frustrated by the choices being made. But the film trusts its audience to sit with the uncertainty and draw their own conclusions, which worked for me, but might not work for other people. Still, those are minor criticisms for me for a movie that does succeed so well in almost every other area. The Invite, I think it's hilarious, emotionally intelligent, beautifully directed, brilliantly acted, and far more layered than its premise, excuse me, might initially suggest. It deserves serious year and consideration for its ensemble and screenplay, and Waz's direction is absolutely going to remain on my mind when award season arrives. So, the pros overall for The Invite, the best directed chamber piece since perhaps 1948's Rope, the ensemble on fire, the funniest film I've seen this year so far, expertly juggles comedy with drama and romantic sentimentality with sexually tense humor, great score that knows when to play at the perfect time. At least I thought. The cons: the film has a lot of ambiguous portions, including its ending. It might frustrate those looking for something more straightforward. But overall, as someone who came in with a little bit of trepidation with this movie, because it's not, these kind of movies kind of are super hit or miss with me. This is a strong contender to end up not just in my top 20 by the end of the year, but maybe even within my proper top 10. This is easily the funniest film I've seen this year. Quite frankly, it might be the funniest film I've seen in a couple of years. I give The Invite an A minus, and there is an outside shot that by the end of the year, I might be willing to bump that up to an A plus. We'll see how I chew on this movie and how the year ends up. But I highly, highly recommend you go see The Invite if it's playing at your local theater. All right, what about this past weekend in new movies? Let's do a quick recap. The live action remake of Moana, which was supposed to be Disney's big cash cow this past weekend to add to the financial success of Toy Story 5, which that movie seems to be on track for $1 billion. Unfortunately for Disney, and a little bit to my surprise, Moana opened to a little under 100 million worldwide. That puts it on track to severely underperform Disney's hopes that it could replicate what Moana 2 did 2 years ago when that movie grossed $1 billion. Is this a sign of live action remake fatigue? I think it's not that easy to say because last year the live action Lilo Stitch and How to Train Your Dragons remakes made plenty of bank. My personal take is that remaking a film that was released just 10 years ago and only 2 years after the less well received sequel made the nostalgia bait for Gen Z audiences ineffective this time around. The film received negative reviews from critics. It only earned a 34% on Rotten Tomatoes, a lowly 41 on Metacritic. Audiences ended up with much more positive, but they ended up still kind of more divided. Casual moviegoers gave it 91% of the popcorn meter last I checked, and an A minus cinema score, which is actually pretty low for these live action remakes. These live action remakes usually get the rare A cinema score. But among sites with much more cinephile heavy user bases, it only has an okayish 3.3 on Letterboxd, which is honestly a little bit higher than I expected, and a lowly 5.9 on IMDb. I do side more with the critics. Again, you heard my C plus review earlier, and you go and read it for yourself on the Substack. Another major release this past weekend that I talked about was Evil Dead Burn, and it also failed to hit that nostalgia high at the box office. The film opened at underperforming numbers and struggled to reach the respectable opening weekend that its predecessor, Evil Dead Rise, enjoyed. The movie received mixed to positive reviews from critics, earning a 71% on Rotten Tomatoes last I checked, and a 55 on Metacritic. The verdict from audiences was much more positive, but not by much. 82% of the popcorn meter, 3.5 on Letterboxd, 6.8 on IMDb, and just a B cinema score. Mix is probably the best way to describe how I felt about this one, as you heard earlier. You heard my C plus review for the movie. And with Evil Dead Wrath coming up next, that's the next Evil Dead movie. Warner Brothers going to have some concerns if audiences are starting to tune this franchise out. Meanwhile, The Invite, which you just heard me do my review of, finally opened wide after technically releasing 2 weeks ago. We can finally take a look at some audience scores. They are pretty damn good so far. Last I checked, the film holds an 89% of the popcorn meter, 4.1 on Letterboxd, and a 7.9 on IMDb. The critical scores are holding up strong as well. 96% on Rotten Tomatoes last I checked, and 82 on Metacritic. I have my trepidations going in again, but this turned out again to be one of the funniest films of the year. One of my and is a strong contender to end up being one of my favorite films of the year, and I highly recommend you guys check it out. So I'm happy that the movie is doing generally well in the specialty box office, and it is well received by critics and audiences. And I also want to do a quickly. I wanted to highlight quickly a newly released film from this past week that I didn't mention, and it was on my radar last week. And that's this little zany comedy called Gail Daughtry and the Celebrity Sex Pass. Critics gave it a solid, but not necessarily spectacular reviews. 79% on Rotten Tomatoes last I checked, 66 on Metacritic. Audiences are kind of in the same camp. It's currently at 3.3 on Letterboxd, just 6.8 on IMDb. Nothing yet on the popcorn meter. I am planning to catch this one sooner than later, though I am a big concern because the premise, which is about this, I guess, like this engaged woman who wants to have a one night stand with John Hamm because as revenge for her fiance getting to use his celebrity sex pass. That premise doesn't really get my attention, and you combine it with the recent run-ins I've had with Zoe Deutsch's performances in movies like this. Remember, I was aggravated by voicemails for Isabel. I was in the minority with that movie. So I'm not really in the rush to see this one, though I have seen some people say that it's sort of a parody of The Wizard of Oz. And I love The Wizard of Oz, and I was a big Wicked stan. So I don't know. I'll eventually get around to it. And of course, when it comes to the next weekend in new movies, there's only one movie to really talk about. It is the biggest and really the only movie of note releasing this upcoming weekend, and that is The Odyssey, Christopher Nolan's follow up to Oppenheimer. That might arguably be the objective film event of the year. The film is tracking to make a major bank at the box office and has already received some rave first reactions. So sorry to all the people who decided to create culture wars by rooting against this movie. I will be catching this at a press screening just after I finish recording and uploading and preparing this podcast episode. It is my second most anticipated film of the year behind only Godzilla Minus Zero. And barring a major surprise, The Odyssey should dominate the box office for at least the next 2 weeks, as it will have a lock on IMAX screens. And there are no major releases arriving the weekend after its debut. So that's basically what it's all going to come down to. This is going to be one of those situations where it's just all about one movie this upcoming weekend, and that is The Odyssey. And I will be watching the movie tonight. I will be releasing a review of it when the embargo drops, and I will be talking about and reviewing the movie on the podcast episode next week for next week. Um, it is all that anyone is going to be thinking or talking about or having discourse over. It's going to be so fascinating to see how audiences react to this film. But so far, the early word of mouth seems to be really good, at least reaction wise, with the critics. All right, now we get to the part of the podcast where I talk about recent film industry news that caught my attention. The Toronto International Film Festival revealed this past week that Sean Heater's follow up to the Best Picture winning Coda, Being Human, will serve as the festival's opening night film. And I have had this as a bubble contender in my recent Oscar projections, but this is a bit of a red flag for me for its award chances. Opening night films at TIFF don't tend to receive much awards love. I mean, The Boy and the Heron in 2023 is a rare exception that went on to win animated feature. Um, I'm curious about this movie, but I liked but didn't love Coda, and I actually was lesser on it after a recent rewatch. It is my personal least favorite of the expanded Best Picture era of Best Picture winners, but I want to give it a chance. But I will say it opening night, not the greatest sign historically. We also learned that TIFF will host the world premiere of Prima Facie, which could be a major acting Oscar vehicle for Cynthia Erivo, which I'm always down to check out a Cynthia Erivo performance. If it were up to me, she would have been nominated for a second year in a row because I do think she played a great Elphaba in both Wicked films. And with TIFF, uh, and to add to that, we'll say I do have Prima Facie pretty. It's as a potential Best Picture nominee, so it's going to be interesting to see how it plays with the TIFF crowd. But with TIFF now officially beginning its slate of rollout, it's another reminder. I've been telling you guys this for a couple weeks now. The first stage of award season campaigning is right around the corner. It will be here before you know it. Prepare yourselves. And meanwhile, Warner Brothers is employing an interesting strategy with its two biggest awards contenders. The studio held major trailer review events for both Dune Part 3 and Digger, with the former receiving a large-scale IMAX event, followed by a Q&A that was streamed worldwide. Meanwhile, the Digger trailer was unveiled on the big screen for critics and influencers in Los Angeles, with Tom Cruise in attendance. It's a fascinating approach to build hype around both films and making sure nobody forgets about what Warner Brothers horses in the race are during the big week for Universal and the Odyssey. I now that I've seen the Digger trailer as I record this, and I've seen the Doom Part 3 trailer, I am starting to understand why Warner Brothers thinks Doom Part 3 is their bigger play for Best Picture nom. It is going to be interesting to see how people react to Digger, even though it does look like Tom Cruise is going all out in his performance. Um, but hey, I do think this is a fascinating sort of like we're going to remind you guys that we're the defending champs, sort of, as a studio from how well we did at last season's Oscars. Warner Brothers turning these turning these trailer reviews into these massive events. And speaking of award season strategies, Focused Features made a major acquisition by picking up Elsinore, the Andrew Scott starring film about Scottish actor Ian Charleston's uh, revered performance as Hamlet during the final weeks of his life as he was dying from AIDS. The film has reportedly been testing through the roof, and Scott has increasingly been discussed as Tom Cruise's, speak of the devil, biggest threat in the Best Actor race. Focus Features acquiring Elsinore on top of already having Sense and Sensibility makes me wonder about the odds of Obsession make it into Best Picture. If these two fall festival titles break big, they could easily become a higher priority for the studio than the horror film that it never originally planned to campaign as a major contender. And I will say, if you guys have checked out the latest Next Best Picture podcast, episode 500, Mailbag, um side episode that they revealed today as I record this, I had a question about this. It was actually the very first question, and th- th- I will say that one of the contributors responded that that these movies have different narratives, which I absolutely 100% agree with you. These movies are going to have different narratives. My case and my argument, however, is that if Focus, which their strategy, much of the way that Neon's strategy of we're going to be this big international player that does well at Cannes, and then we're going to play the cinephiles. Their strategy tends to be we're going to show up at the fall festivals, we're going to get people to love one or two of our movies, and then we're going to go release in October and or November and go from there. And usually get a lot of love, particularly from the British contingent of the Academy, because a lot of focus tends to go with things that the British really respond to. Um, if that happens, I don't. It's not like they're going to completely toss out Obsession, but I just think that it's easy to see them kind of see Obsession as a third priority, where maybe they could still get Indians, much like Song Sung Blue last year was clearly a third priority, but they were still able to get Kate Hudson in for actress. Um, and I will say, I just, and that's what's keeping me very, why I'm being so careful with pulling the trigger on Obsession. And maybe look, again, y'all y'all know about my review. It's a I didn't write a full length review, but I did do a full length sort of like review here on the podcast. I am one of the 5 people who did not vibe with Obsession. I did not like that movie. I am not rooting for it to get into Best Picture. I do not understand the hype around that movie. But I'm trying to be objective because it's not like every movie that gets into Best Picture is one of my favorites of the year or anything like that. And there have been movies I outright dislike that get nominated for Best Picture. Um, but I don't think I think it's fair to ask, like, what is Focus doing here? Because they do know what they're doing, and Obsession was not supposed to be their top priority at the beginning of the year. And sometimes that happens. Everything Everywhere wasn't supposed to be A24's top priority. Top Gun Maverick wasn't supposed to be Paramount's priority. But things happen that way sometimes. But if Elsinore hits, and I'm hearing from buzz that it's really, really gonna hit probably with audiences, and since the sensibility does better than some of us are expecting, that could complicate things for Obsession. Meanwhile, Neon made waves by announcing its acquisition of Artificial, Nico Guadagnino's film about AI and tech billionaires. And interestingly, the studio is not planning a major festival run for this movie. I've seen some speculation about a secret New York Film Festival premiere, but regardless, this news combined with whispers that some studios are feeling more mixed and less confident about the movie than Neon continues to leave me skeptical about whether it's the awards contender that some believe it is. Not to mention that I've heard stories that that there's a reason that there were studios who passed up on it. It wasn't just some political thing. Like A24 apparently is like getting into bed with some AI stuff, so that might be a situation with why they passed on it. But that's not necessarily a thing with all of the studios. And we do have to remember that Luca, it's not like the dude is universally loved. His movies aren't constantly universally loved, but you know, we'll see. We'll see how the movie plays, but it does kind of worry me that they're not willing to do a big major festival run with it. But again, it could have a secret premiere at NIFF. We'll see what happens. And then there's something that I was not able to write about in the weekly digest that I used to help me with notes for this podcast, and that is the sudden passing that I woke up the news of Sam Neill. And everybody is of course giving their tributes to Sam Neill, passed away at age 78. And the tragic thing about this is that he had just beaten cancer and was looking forward to getting back into doing some more film roles. Um and everybody's paying tribute, and of course, everybody's bringing up Jurassic Park as they should, because when you think of Sam Neill, the role that he's probably going to be the most remembered for will be as Dr. Alan Grant in Jurassic Park, and he showed up a few times again in the sequels, in lesser sequels, unfortunately, but that's what he's always going to be remembered for. But he has been in other great stuff. He was in Possession, which is a massive horror classic, especially international horror classic. Um, he was in The Piano, which came close to winning Best Picture. Probably one of the few Jane Campion films that I think I would call to be truly great. Um, he was in Peaky Blinders. He did a great job in Peaky Blinders during that second season. Was he in the first season? I forget. I want to say he was. I want to say he was in the second, first or second, but he was in Peaky Blinders, and he was great there. He he's been in a lot more than just Jurassic Park. He was in an Omen sequel, for instance. He was recently the Peter Rabbit movies. He's gonna be in Godzilla and Kong Supernova, which I think is gonna end up being his final credited role, because that movie's been filmed, and it's coming out next spring, and it's going to be very interesting to see that as his final film. And it's exciting to see Sam Neill in a Godzilla and Kong movie, especially as the dude from Jurassic Park, as most people would know him as. He's also in I forget the exact name, but he's also in that movie with Meryl Streep about that tragic man, and this hits hard given being a girl dad of a newborn. That tragic case of that dingo that killed that child, and the mom was unjustifiably accused of murder. Um, but um, yeah, there's not much else I can say. The man's work speaks for itself. He will be remembered for a long time for being some of the great classics. He was a great actor. By everything that I've seen, he seemed like a chill and cool dude. He had his own farm and everything. And I look forward to seeing him one more time in being part of my all-time favorite film franchise of all time in the Godzilla movie next year. But rest in peace to Sam Neill. Sad breaking news, and we will always have him in the great films and roles that he was in. And in terms of what else was on my mind that is not involving film, the film industry this past week, we are coming up on the semifinals of the 2026 FIFA World Cup, hosted by the North American countries of the US, Canada, Mexico. Big all leading up to the big finals, which are going to be in New York. And as I stated before, I am not going to be performative and pretend to be a huge soccer fan or act like I'm that invested in who wins this. That said, I was at my buddy's house this past weekend, and he had the quarterfinal matches on. The people at the small party that he was hosting were pretty invested. I even ended up sticking around and watching the entire Argentina versus Switzerland match. Um, but I did find myself in this weird position of rooting against my own country. The United States struck what I thought was a clearly corrupt deal with FIFA to get a suspended player reinstated right before its quarterfinal match against Belgium. And I got a huge kick out of watching, huge kick, no pun intended, out of watching the Belgians pull off the upset. We absolutely cheated. I saw so many people trying to cope and make excuses for this. We cheated. We got involved in some corrupt stuff with a corrupt organization and a corrupt president at that. And we absolutely deserve to lose. I've said this before. I am not much for patriotism these days, which probably made it easier for me to enjoy watching Belgium, you know, serve us a big heap of karma and knock us out. But regardless, blatant cheating and corruption is always going to make me instantly turn against a team. It's always going to do. I don't give a crap if it was the U.S. Call me a traitor if you want, but I got such a kick out of that. But I will say, as someone who's not really into soccer, is not really that invested, it is kind of cool to see a lot of people invested in this. And I think that pretty much does it for this week's episode right there, as I am going to be hurriedly trying to put this together so that I can go ahead and get ready to go see the Odyssey with my own eyeballs. And I will be talking about that next weekend. If you want to check out my work, as always, mendezmoviereport.com. You can read reviews for everything that I talked about. Read the weekly digest so you can already see what I'm going to talk about on the podcast. I'm going to get a review of the Odyssey up. I'm going to get an update to Oscar projections post the Odyssey. It's a big release. Will be coming up soon also. If you want to catch me on all social media, I'm available everywhere under Mendez Movie RPT. And if you happen to want to email me, I'm available at author, as in a writer, author L Mendez at gmail.com. So that's it for this week's episode. Thank you so much for listening. And until then, do me a big favor and go watch a great movie for me.